Thank you, Ann. I appreciate having friends in New York. I still have relatives in New York since I grew up in Brooklyn, and still grew up at Kings Highway, Ocean Avenue. Went to James Madison High School, PS 197, Junior High School 234, and I still have relatives that live in Mill Basin. But most of my family has kind of left New York for the softer confines of New Jersey. So, but I found my way out to the Midwest. University of Iowa Law School and joined the Minnesota Attorney General in 1976, was a Solicitor General of the state, was there for 17 years, Solicitor General of the state of Minnesota, Chief Prosecutor. I was the mayor of St. Paul for 8 years. I always tell people that I may have senator in front of my name, I still have mayor stitched in my underwear. You don't forget, will you? So I focus on getting things done. I want to thank everybody here for being here on a Sunday afternoon. To talk about the UN's treatment of Israel, or perhaps I should say mistreatment, but perhaps most importantly what we should do about it, because I go back to my mayoral days and I do like to focus on solutions. So it's not we can all get together and raise our concerns, but what are you going to do? And I hope that this conference provides some focus on that, and I will add what little bit I can. This institute takes its name indirectly from the explorer Henry Hudson. You'll recall that after he led the expedition that introduced Europeans to much of this local territory, his followers mutinied, tied him up, put him in a small boat, set him out, drifting out into what later became Hudson Bay to his death. Israel, founded on the ideals the UN stands for, may feel a bit like Henry. We need to work to gain her a better fate. I missed by several years a chance to serve in the Senate with the distinguished New Yorker Daniel Patrick Moynihan. As I read over the record of resolutions of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council pertaining to Israel and the statements from entities of the UN equating Zionism with racism, I want to use a line he sometimes employed during a Senate debate. Never have I heard the opposite of truth so precisely stated. The UN was created to give power to small nations who respected international ideals of justice and freedom. But instead of treating Israel as it deserves to be treated, as an equal member in good standing, the UN chooses year after year to castigate it. This strange phenomenon was already present at the UN when Moynihan arrived at Turtle Bay to serve as United States Ambassador to the United Nations in July of 1975. In his memoir of his experience at the UN, aptly entitled A Dangerous Place, Moynihan observed that Israel was, quote, the center of the political life of the United Nations, close quote. In fact, it was in 1975 that the infamous Zionism is Racism resolution was passed by the General Assembly, which remained in place until 1991 when Assistant Secretary for International Organizations John Bolton led a successful campaign to repeal it. And we owe him our great debt of gratitude. If we jump forward several decades past the tenure of Patrick Moynihan at the UN, we see that much hasn't changed. And the discrimination of Israel is as brazen as ever, and I presume that most in this room know the record, perhaps even better than I do. The General Assembly passes more resolutions in Israel than any other country by remaining relatively silent on countries like Sudan. UN bodies mandated by the General Assembly purportedly to look after the welfare of the Palestinian people, the Committee on the Exercise of Vulnerable Rights of the Palestinian People, the Division of the Palestinian Rights, and Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of Palestinian people. These serve as nothing more other than being platforms to attack Israel. The current so-called Human Rights Council has actually proven itself to be more of a human rights travesty than its predecessor, and even more of a bully towards Israel. And considering the actions of its predecessor, that is a pretty low bar to get under. The single-minded focus on Israel, while ignoring or being impotent in dealing with massive oppression in places like Burma, Zimbabwe, genocide in Darfur, certainly is inexcusable. And I could go on, but again, I presume you're all familiar with the list. As someone who's become deeply involved in UN issues in my role as United States Senator, I've sought to understand what exactly is it about the UN that leads to such distorted outcomes. I recently spoke at an AEI conference that was called Who Leads the United Nations? And I think that the very title of this conference offers some insight as to why we see those types of outcomes. In my efforts to pursue UN reform, I was quickly educated on the question of who controls the United Nations General Assembly. And much to my dismay, I've learned that it is the voting bloc of the G77, which now includes 132 nations. So their math isn't that good either. In the General Assembly, 132 nations is an overwhelming majority. On the UN reform front, we are at an absolute stalemate because these 132 developing nations, most of which are undemocratic, have absolutely no interest in transparency and accountability at the United Nations. Guess why? If they practice transparency and accountability back home, they could be overthrown. Curiously, the identity of this developing country bloc is also marked by Israel bashing, even though not all members of the G77 necessarily have any natural reasons to take political cheap shots at Israel. This G77 voting bloc of developing nations evolved from the non-aligned movement that Moynihan recounts as working in direct opposition to UN interest during his time, U.S. interest during his time at the United Nations in the 1970s. By the time Moynihan came on the scene, the non-aligned movement voting bloc had integrated the demonization of Israel into its agenda due to the influence of anti-Israel Arab states and the Cold War political maneuverings of the Soviet Union, among other factors. And this feature of the developing country agenda has remained with the G77, 56 members of the 132 members of which comprise the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Like a big party in a coalition government, these 56 agree to play along as long as the others accept their stance on Israel. In studying the United Nations, I have found that the structure of one country, one vote lends itself to a situation where the likes of the OIC have free rein in pushing their agendas, particularly when they have the entire G77 on board. The situation is exacerbated by the system of regional groups within a broader framework of consensus-based decision-making. This has basically enhanced the ability of countries with specific agendas, such as demonizing Israel, to wield disproportionate power. It creates strange alliances and allows feckless states to tolerate the attacks on Israel in the name of regional solidarity and consensus. This helps explain why the performance of many of our friends serving in the United Nations Human Rights Council with respect to the treatment of Israel has been such a disappointment. Well, if I learned anything from my Jewish background, it's this: you should never be surprised when bad things happen. 1948 was an important moment in history when Israel was created almost 6 decades ago. But the forces that attempt to destroy the literal and spiritual Israel have been around for many thousands of years. We know in our bones that it is better to light a candle than to simply curse the darkness. In a more philosophical statement to the same point, Viktor Frankl told us that the essential human freedom is the ability to decide how to react to what happens to us, to make moral choices above and beyond the physical circumstances. My choice when it comes to UN demonization of a nation I love and respect is 1, to hold the UN's feet to the fire, and 2, to light a candle, to attract more nations to our point of view. As you all know, the United Nations provides 22% of the assessed budget and several billions of dollars of voluntary contributions to different United Nations agencies. Those of us in Congress should be embarrassed as stewards of taxpayer dollars, even if only 2.2% of these Israel-bashing shenanigans were financed on the American nickel. And the sad reality is that U.S. money is involved in funding these outrages, sometimes inadvertently. I think much more needs to be done to address this situation. I have worked over the past several months to ensure that Congress takes a real step in responding to the blatant demonization of Israel by the United Nations. As you all know, in June, the Human Rights Council celebrated its first year anniversary of its operation. The celebration was marked by adopting Israel as a permanent agenda item, among other absurdities. I marked the anniversary by introducing a bill stating it will be our policy that no funding provided by the United States to the United Nations shall be used to support the Human Rights Council. This piece of legislation passed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee unanimously, a very rare display of unanimity in condemning a UN body. That was no small feat from a committee that generally avoids any criticism of the organization. I then worked to pass this bill in the full Senate by attaching it as an amendment to the FY 208 Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill. I am committed to ensuring that our money our taxpayers provide to the UN is not used to perpetuate anti-Semitism and flat-out demonization of Israel. I think an obvious and necessary response from the Congress of the United States, which is the largest donor of the United Nations, is to deny funding to entities that engage in Israel bashing.